Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
This is a true story from a friend of mine, and she gave me permission to share it. According to her, it was all a twist of fate, an accident that turned out to be destiny. Her name is Jane Fang. We'll call her Jane, and she used to be my next-door neighbor. Jane was absolutely stunning growing up, slim and athletic thanks to years of training with a professional swim team. I, on the other hand, was never the pretty one, and naturally gravitated toward her, always wanting to be around her light. Jane's parents divorced when we were in 3rd grade. Her father had been a sent-down youth during the Cultural Revolution and met her mother, a local woman from the Northwest, while he was stationed there. When he returned to the city, he brought his wife and daughter back with him. But once he settled back into urban life, he began to look down on Jane's mom, eventually leading to their divorce. After that, Jane stayed with her mom. Since her mother had no relatives or stable work in the city, they struggled financially, moving from job to job just to get by. Jane and I spent most of our after-school time together, unless she had swim practice. Sometimes I'd tag along. Her team wasn't strict as long as visitors didn't cause trouble. We grew up. Jane went to a sports university and I went abroad. Even so, I came back every year and we stayed as close as ever. But everything changed the year she was about to graduate from college, because that's when she met a man who would change her fate completely. In many colleges, there are people who act as informal recruiters. They find pretty young women to attend parties or social events hosted by wealthy businessmen. It's not overtly shady. The girls are usually there to add to the atmosphere, sing karaoke, drink, and sometimes walk away with a few thousand yuan. Naturally, a girl as gorgeous as Jane was often targeted and persuaded to attend. From her 2nd year on, Jane paid for all her tuition and living expense through these events. And it was at one of these events that she met Andrew Zhao. Andrew Zhao was the general manager of a well-known tech company in Zhongguancun. He got the position not through merit, but because he married the boss's daughter, making him the son-in-law of the chairman. Despite that, Andrew came from a rural background and was obsessed with having a son to carry on his name. Unfortunately, his wealthy wife couldn't have children. Feeling desperate, he confided in his secretary, who told him that many rich men keep a mistress specifically to have a son. Andrew liked that idea. So the secretary started scouting for a candidate and saw Jane at a dinner party. She was beautiful, healthy, and athletic, the kind of woman with good genes. Soon after, Andrew started pursuing Jane. At first, Jane thought she was just getting paid to drink coffee and smile, 2,000 or 3,000 yuan for a chat. Easy money. But then Andrew started taking her shopping and showering her with expensive gifts. She quickly fell for his charm and generosity. Andrew made a deal with her. If she gave him a son, he'd give her 2 luxury apartments, a large sum of cash, and even fund her studies abroad. Jane thought it was a decent offer. At the time, she and her mom were still living in her dad's small apartment, and her father, remarried by then, was constantly trying to kick them out. So they struck a deal. Andrew first rented Jane a fancy apartment to live in, and before long she was pregnant. Andrew was thrilled. But then a major problem arose. Jane was unmarried, and in China that meant the baby couldn't be legally registered, no ID, no school, nothing. And it would be impossible to explain to others. Andrew's secretary suggested a fake marriage. Just find someone willing to be a stand-in husband, pay enough, and there'd be plenty of takers. Jane and Andrew both thought it was a great idea. Soon the secretary found a young man named Eric Yang. He was tall, decent-looking, and worked for one of Andrew's suppliers. He looked good enough to make the fake marriage seem believable. Eric agreed to the deal because he was broken and his fiancée's family wouldn't approve their marriage without a house. The terms were simple. Marry Jane, pretend to be her husband for a year until the baby was born, then quietly divorce. He'd get 500,000 yuan up front and another 500,000 after the divorce, a fortune at the time. So, Andrew, Jane, the secretary, and Eric all went to the civil office. Jane and Eric signed the papers and were officially married. Before doing this, Jane demanded that one of the promised apartments be signed over to her immediately. No more empty promises. So, Andrew bought the place she was already living in and put it under her name. To make the marriage look real, Jane drove Andrew's luxury car and brought Eric home to meet her parents. She told them it was Eric's apartment they were living in. Her dad didn't care much, but her mom was pleased. Eric seemed kind, respectful, and responsible. They even held a small get-together with Jane's college friends. Everything looked perfect. Andrew and Jane told Eric he could live his life freely. Just show up when needed to play the part of the loving husband. But as time went on, Jane's mom started inviting her home for meals, wanting to take care of her pregnant daughter. Jane brought Eric along to keep up appearances. The more they spent time together, the more Jane realized Eric was a good guy. Kind, polite, well-educated, a great cook, athletic, everything Andrew wasn't. But sadly, Eric was poor and Andrew was rich. Then the trouble started. Andrew, ever the control freak, secretly arranged an ultrasound to find out the baby's gender. In mainland China, gender disclosure during pregnancy is illegal due to past issues with sex-selective abortions. But Andrew had connections. The result? It was a girl, and Jane was already over 6 months along. So, what now? Andrew completely lost it. A girl? No way, he didn't want a daughter. He tried to convince Jane to have an abortion. He insisted a girl was unacceptable. But Jane, feeling her belly and knowing this was already a living, healthy baby, refused. She was 6 months along, too far in for an abortion without serious risks to her own life. And morally, she couldn't bring herself to end it. They fought over it again and again, but Jane wouldn't budge. Then Andrew got another idea. Since Jane had grown close to Eric over the past few months, maybe Eric could convince her. Andrew offered Eric more money to talk her into ending the pregnancy. Eric flat out refused. "I'm not doing something that heartless," he said. Over time, he'd come to admire Jane, aside from the fact that she was involved with a married man. She was good-hearted, smart, and kind. And now, with 500,000 yuan already in his pocket, Eric had the confidence to say no. Andrew, furious, raised his hand to slap Eric, but Eric was faster. He caught Andrew's wrist and shoved him back a few meters. Andrew was livid. He vowed to get back at Eric later. But for now, his priority was to solve the baby problem. So he returned to Jane's apartment, only to find it empty. She was gone. She had packed her things and disappeared. Panic set in. If Jane gave birth and used the child to threaten or blackmail him in the future, it could ruin him. He immediately ordered his secretary to track her down. The secretary figured the best bet was to start with Eric. But Eric had gone underground too. With no leads, Andrew and the secretary decided to visit Eric's girlfriend. Let's call her Cindy. They showed Cindy proof that Eric had legally married another woman. When Cindy saw the photos and paperwork, she broke down sobbing. She and Eric had been together for 3 years, planning to marry. Now this, she kept crying, repeating, "How could he betray me like this?" But fate's twists weren't over yet. As Andrew stood nearby watching Cindy cry, he noticed something. She kept complaining about Eric's lack of money, about how he couldn't afford a home. And Cindy herself? She was attractive, elegant, and desperate. Andrew had another bright idea. He started comforting her, then asking her out, gifting her luxury items. The usual playbook. Before long, Cindy fell for him too, and yes, you guessed it, she agreed to have his baby. Absolutely unreal. At first, Eric had no idea his girlfriend was now with Andrew. All he knew was that she'd seen the marriage certificate and exploded in rage. He tried explaining it was all for money to buy a home for their future. But Cindy had made up her mind. She wanted nothing more to do with him. Eric didn't push. He figured he'd wait until she cooled off and talk to her again later. Meanwhile, Jane had nowhere else to go. Desperate, she called Eric. He was the only person she could trust. Eric booked a hotel room and helped her hide out. But a few days later, while they were on their way to grab some food, a group of thugs suddenly ambushed them and forced Jane into a narrow alley. Their target was clear. They began brutally attacking her stomach, trying to force a miscarriage. Jane curled up on the ground, clutching her belly, terrified. Of course she knew this was Andrew's doing. Eric rushed in, fighting off the attackers. But there were too many of them. He was badly beaten and couldn't protect her. In a last-ditch move, he threw himself over Jane's body, shielding her with his own, absorbing punch after punch and kick after kick. The beating went on for several minutes. Eventually, the thugs saw blood pooling beneath Jane and ran off. Eric scooped her up and bolted to the main street, screaming for help. Jane, barely conscious, whispered in his ear, "You're a good man." Eric didn't stop. He flagged down a car and a bystander called an ambulance. They rushed to the ER. Jane survived the emergency surgery, but the baby didn't. She'd lost her daughter. Afterward, it was Eric who stayed by her side in the hospital, taking care of her. Every evening he came with homemade meals. They talked and laughed softly over dinner like a real married couple. During the day, Eric was busy too. He tracked down Andrew's real wife. Turns out she'd long suspected her husband was cheating but had chosen to look the other way. Now, with all the drama exposed, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Andrew's father-in-law got involved. Furious, he forced Andrew to sign the divorce papers and kicked him out with nothing. "You leave with zero," he said, "not a penny." Overnight, Andrew lost everything. His wife, his wealth, his job. And Cindy? As soon as he was broke, she left without even saying goodbye. Poetic justice. Jane, ashamed of her past, chose not to report the assault to the police. She didn't want her friends or family to know what had happened. Fortunately, Andrew had given her that apartment, and no one came to take it back. Andrew was down and out with no position and no power. His secretary, too, was booted from the company. Jane stayed in the hospital for a long time. With Eric's care, she slowly recovered. After being discharged, she returned to her mother's place for a while. Later, she sold the apartment Andrew had bought her, quickly and cleanly. And Eric? Jane told me that on the day she left the hospital, she mustered the courage to ask him, "Do you still want to get divorced?" Eric smiled at her, and just like that, they became a real couple. I remember when I came back to China that year, she introduced Eric to me as her husband. I was surprised. I'd never heard of him before. I even teased her about getting married so fast. Later, I helped them look at houses, and they ended up settling in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood with great amenities. 3 years later, they had a child of their own, and to this day, they're still living happily together.